anything that explains why one buyer is willing to pay a different price than another buyer. This is context.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
It's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the contextual relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving, and I run boot camps to help companies get paid more. Our host today is Stephen Forth. I'm just going to hand it over. Stephen, it's all you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mark. And it's nice to be able to turn the tables on you for a change. The reason we're here is that there has been a lot of change happening in pricing circles. And there have been some really critical new ideas and new ways of thinking about pricing surfacing. And one of the ones that I'm really excited about is this thing called context-driven pricing, which originates with you. And you've been sharing a lot of ideas about it. And I've been thinking hard about it and starting to apply it to the work that I do and my company Ibbaka does on the design of pricing. So what I'd like to do today is really understand what context-driven pricing is. Before we dive into that, though, where did this come from? What motivated you to start thinking about context-driven pricing?
It's you and every other pricing expert in the field. I would go on LinkedIn and I would ask the question, what is value? Right? Because I am a huge fan of value-based pricing. I dearly love value-based pricing. But we could never agree on what value means. And I could give you 3 or 4 definitions, which I think are really reasonable definitions for what we do as pricing folks. And it's like, I need something to say, here's the strategy that really matters. And so what's the strategy that really matters? It's charge what someone's willing to pay, period. Now, I'll give you a little nuance behind that as well. But I think that the optimal price is charging what a customer is willing to pay. Now, what's the name of that? Calling it willingness to pay pricing seemed really horrible. Different people are willing to pay based on different situations or what, in essence, context. And so after just thinking about it for way too long, context-driven pricing came to us and we're like, oh, that's a great name for this. So I created context-driven pricing so I could define it. And I defined it as charge what a customer is willing to pay.
So let's peel off a layer here. So I'm going to put aside the whole conversation about value and willingness to pay for a moment. We may come back to it. But where I'd really like to focus in on is context. So when you say context, what are some of the different contexts that you have in mind that provide, dare I say it, the context for context-driven pricing?
Yes. Well, first off, let's define context in this world, in this world of context-driven pricing. And I think of context as anything that explains why one buyer is willing to pay a different price than another buyer. This is context. And so I've categorized context, and whether someone else categorizes it differently is totally fine. But I've crafted 4 different contexts that I think of that matter. And I do this not because I think you have to be able to categorize a context, but it helps you think through the contexts. What are the contexts that I might be missing? And so the 4 categories that I've crafted are problem. And the problem in my mind is the single most important concept. I'm sure we're going to talk about that as we go through this. And then the other 3 are customer. So tell me something about the buyer, something about the customer. So these could be demographics. It could be psychographics, whatever it is we want to make it. Behavioral. So how is it that they go about their shopping behavior? How much do they do search? And then the last one is the one that you would probably expect, and that's environmental, right? What's the weather like? What's the economy doing? What did the competitors do? So there's 4 different categories of context that we could think of. And to me, the answer is whatever influences somebody's willingness to pay.
So let's unpeel those those contexts a bit more, though those different contexts. And I'm going to start at the end and work my way back to problem, if I may. So the environment. How does the environment change and shape willingness to pay?
Oh, that's easy. So let's in most of these, there's two different types of context. So let me split those most of them up into, I'm going to call them stable and fluctuating, because it kind of changes the way you think about it. And so let's talk about environment, and we'll do a stable context first. People in Minnesota are willing to pay more for a snowblower than people in Texas. Why is that? Because the climate's different, right? So that's a context that drives willingness to pay. Let's talk about fluctuating. In Minnesota, people are probably willing to pay more for a snowblower in the winter than they are in the summer, right? This is context again. And so what is the context of selling a snowblower? I'd rather sell them in the winter in Minnesota at higher prices. And if I have to put them on discount, I'll do that in the summer. Or if I could get someone in Texas to buy one, heck, in fact, I'd probably have a different type of snowblower, right? A really small one that was easy to use. And, maybe I could get someone to give me a few $100 for it.
Can you say a little bit more about competitors as part of the environment?
So competitors, you could fit that as most of the things I talk about, you could fit that in a different category as well. So I might put that in the behavior category, as in, as a shopper, am I looking at a competitor or not looking at a competitor? But from a contextual point of view, let's talk about international pricing for a second. I might be selling something in the US where there are a lot of competitors for something. And then I turn around and I sell it someplace else, and there are very few competitors for it. And so that's very contextual as what does the environment look like? What does the market look like in that situation versus a different situation?
So using the stable versus fluctuating frame that you said, um, can you give us some examples of a stable competitive environment versus a fluctuating competitive environment?
I don't know that I've thought of that, but let's do one real quickly, right? I mean, so stable is obvious, right? It's the market. How many competitors are in the marketplace? Fluctuating. Oh, this is a great one. Your competitor just lowered their price. What are you going to do now?
Mhm.
Right. So that's a fluctuating context.
Okay, and that's one of the things that will help determine the willingness to pay.
Sure. So if I'm looking as a shopper, if a shopper is looking at two different alternatives and both of them are, around $100, and then all of a sudden one of them lowers their price to $80, guess what? That influences my shopper's willingness to pay.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the old pricing concept that we use all the time of cross price elasticity.
Yep.
The tendency of a buyer to switch vendors depending on the price.
Yep. No, that's exactly right. And you've probably heard me talk about will I and which one. In my world, that's the which one decision, right?
Hmm.
Whose am I going to go buy?
Yeah, and the will I is well, actually, the will I and which one is an important part of some of your other work that you've used to train pricing GPT. Um, Put the sort of will I verse and which one frame onto context driven pricing if you can.
Okay, so this is actually going to take us a little while to get there, if that's okay, Stephen.
Sure. No, follow your.
Okay, so the first thing I want to mention is that let me tell the story this way. How much should Uber charge? Well, I don't know. It depends, right? Well, what does it depend on? Well, it depends on a lot of different things. But the first thing it depends on, and the highest level problem it depends on, is what market segment are we going after? So are we talking about Uber people, right? So when you and I take an Uber somewhere, are we talking about Uber Eats when they deliver food? Are we talking about Uber Connect when they deliver packages for businesses? Right? Those are three very different market segments. They solve very different problems. I call these foundational problems. Right? So what is it? Why would you ever buy something from Uber? Well, because I need to get from my house to the airport. That's a foundational problem. And it turns out that is the will I decision. Once you pick any one of those market segments, you step into what I'll call the problem scope, right? So what's the product portfolio that we're going to use to address a problem scope? So now we go to Uber, and we'll talk about Uber people, right? We've got Uber X and Uber Rideshare and Uber Comfort and Uber XL. And I live in Reno. It's Uber Ski here in the wintertime, right? And so they've got these different products to manage different scopes. And as a buyer, I'm going to take a look at the context of what's the problem I'm trying to solve now, as I'm trying to choose which one of those alternatives I want for that product portfolio. By the way, you could put Lyft in that list. So now we've got, am I going to choose Uber or am I going to choose Lyft? Because I want to know what's the best way to solve the problem that I have right now. Now let's go one more layer deeper. So we started out with market segments, product portfolio. Now we're going to go to price segmentation. So at the level of price segmentation, I want to get from my house to the airport. Are there any environmental conditions that impact how much I'd be willing to pay for that? Right. So it's Christmas time. There's no parking at the airport. I need to leave at 4 a.m. How much do you want to charge me? I'm just going to pay whatever it is. Right. And so there are these factors that say, hey, we could adjust our prices based on environmental conditions at the price segmentation level. So we think of those three layers. I think of those three layers as layers of context. So you've got a foundational problem, you've got the problem scope, and then you've got the situational context. I also think of those as three different business decision layers, right? So at the top, you've got market segments. The next layer down, you've got the product portfolio, and your pricing metric goes in that section. And the layer below that is price segmentation. How are we actually going to get a price to a customer? So the will I and the which one fit. Will I is at the top, which one is in the middle. And then the bottom, you could almost argue that's just willingness to pay, right? Given that I've already made a choice that I'm going to buy this thing, how much am I going to pay for it?
So Mark, listening to you, this reminds me a little bit of listening to a someone like Craig Zawada at Pros, or Stefan Liozu at Zilliant, or Gabe Smith at PriceFX, who are always talking about dynamic pricing and the different factors that determine the dynamic price that their pricing recommendation engine is going to is going to suggest to the salesperson. How would you compare and contrast context-driven pricing with the dynamic pricing approaches that have been developed by the big old heavy metal vendors over the last couple of decades, really?
Yeah. So when I think about the pricing systems, the pricing software companies, the experience I've had with them is usually they just I don't mean to demean it at all, right? But they input a ton of transaction data, and they try to make sense of it to say, oh, this quote is like these other customers that bought at these prices, so therefore we should quote at this price. And so they're doing micro segmentation. I haven't seen them go back and say, oh, well, we do different micro segments for this market segment than we do for this market segment.
I think they may be doing that. I think it might get one of those guys on and go through their approach with them, because I'm in. To me, one of the pushbacks against the dynamic pricing optimization is they're a bit of a black box.
Yep.
And I've never met a buyer who responds happily to the statement, my pricing optimization system says you should be willing to pay X, therefore I'm going to charge you X. That's not going to be a productive conversation. And what context-driven pricing is doing is it's exposing the reasoning behind that. It's opening up the black box and making the black box understandable. I'd like to just take a quick side detour here before we go to problem. So one of the big themes in artificial intelligence over the last few years has been explainable AI. That the AI needs to be able to explain the recommendation it's giving, or the advice it's giving, or the context, whatever it's doing. Do you see context-driven pricing as a way to help generative AIs explain the pricing advice that they're being asked to give?
Um, Possibly. Here's how I actually see the intersection with AI and context-driven pricing. Right? I see that context-driven pricing is really hard. Right? I mean, you could look at any individual and say, how much would you be willing to pay for something? And it's just, we can't read someone's mind. It's going to take a lot of processing power to figure that out. So could we put structure behind this so that we have a way to think about it? And in reality, that's why I crafted that value architecture I just described to you, is because these are decisions that companies have to make, and here's how it fits with this world of context. But on the other hand, context-driven pricing, I think it guides AI into how to make pricing recommendations. Right, as opposed to, can I use CDP to explain AI or AI recommendations? It's, can I use AI to help implement context-driven pricing? And I think that's really what's going to happen, is that if people want to adopt context-driven pricing, then we can start to layer on, how is it that we can find those foundational problems? How is it that we define the problem scope? How is it that we define the willingness to pay for a given product in a given situation? Right. And that will be explainable, because what we're doing isn't putting a price on something because you look like those other people. What we're really doing is we're putting a price on something because we understand the context.
So you mentioned problem in that, and that's where we started, right? As the four contexts are the problem context, the customer context, the behavioral context, and the environmental context. I'd like to jump all the way up to problem now. Now, other people have been looking at jobs to be done as a way of informing a pricing. Uh, at Ibbaka, we've been doing that in a couple of ways. We used jobs to be done as one layer of our agent pricing layer cake, something we've discussed in the past. And we also used it to generate a concept blend of B2B SaaS and jobs to be done in the context of pricing, and AI agents and jobs to be done in the concept of pricing. How does context-driven pricing use the idea of jobs to be done, or is that a separate sort of area for you?
So I am going to say three magic words. I don't know. So, so I had problems ingrained in my head when I was instructing with pragmatic marketing. This was a long time ago, right? And so I've always thought about problems. And then, I read Clayton Christensen, Jobs to be Done, and I could never say, well, what's the difference between jobs to be done and problems? And I would ask people and they would give me answers that I never thought was right. And, it wasn't clear. So to me, they're very, very similar concepts. To me, I can deal with problems because I understand problems and I understand results. So my third book was called Selling Value. And in selling value, I defined something I called a value table.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, a value table
Right.
is, yeah. So to me, a value table is, what's your solution? So it could be your product or feature. What's the problem it solves? What's the result someone gets when they solve that problem? And then in B2B, how much money are we going to make someone because they solved that problem and got that result? Right. So it's a really easy way for me to articulate what is value in a B2B world. And so I've always thought that way.
So Mark, would it be fair to say that one of the key skills in being able to do context-driven pricing is to be able to do a really good job of defining the problem?
Oh my gosh, yes. That, that absolutely. And what's fascinating about it is that as soon as you see two people with different willingnesses to pay, What you know is that there's a different problem there.
Hmm.
Now it could just be the size of the problem. It could be how much they care about the problem, but it is all about the problem at that point in time.
So how do you go about uncovering and defining the problem? Uh, yeah, is there a good way to do that?
So this is hard. First off, let's articulate that there are layers of problems. One of my favorite examples that I use is Ted Levitt once said, "Nobody wants to buy a quarter-inch drill. What they want to buy is a quarter-inch hole." Turns out, absolutely nobody wants to buy a quarter-inch hole. What they really want to do is buy the ability to hang a picture over their fireplace. Well, actually, they don't really want to hang a picture over their fireplace. They really want a nice-looking living room, right? So we could take layers of problems. Now, how do we find that right layer of problem? There is no one single answer as to what's the problem that we're going to go address, or we're going to go market to, or we're going to price for. We need to understand what's that layer for any given customer. So again, it's very contextual. How are they going to think about it? How are we going to think about it? And how can we make it big enough that it's a market segment if we're going to talk about it, right? That it's enough people that it makes sense for us to talk about. So here's how I typically do when I work with my clients. Most of them are B2B clients. What I do is I ask them to list 10 customers, different customers, and I ask them to list 10 or more features of their product. I typically call them marketable product features. So you built these because they solved a problem for a customer. And then on a scale of 0 to 5, how much does each customer value each feature? So now take a look across any given row, and there's some zeros and there's some fives. Why? That's what starts to point out what's the problem,
Hmm.
right? Now you were going to dive down into, can we truly define that problem? Can we truly articulate what's going on? And they'll say something like, well, they've already got a solution, or, they don't do it this way. Great. We're learning what the problem is for the people who value it.
So, given the centrality of understanding the problem and defining the problem to context driven pricing, but also to marketing as a whole and product design as a whole, you know, uh, is there any way to use AI to help us to better understand and better define problems? Or is there any way that you can get a prompt to help you do this?
Is that a softball, Stephen? I've been working on it. Truly, I have. And I've got a special way to write problems. So when I write a problem statement, I want it to be in first person. So as though you're talking, uh, as though it's your customer talking, right? I want it to not have anything to do with the solution in the problem statement.
Mhm.
And I want it to have some emotional impact or negative impact that makes it worthwhile. So it's not just a fact. And so what I did was I did craft a small mini agent in my pricing GPT. And so today, if you go in there and you type pricing colon, and I'm about to change it to comma pricing, but if you type pricing colon and then you write a problem statement, whatever problem statement you want, it's going to analyze your problem statement and it's going to say, yeah, that's not how Mark would have done it. And then it'll rewrite it for you. And then it'll also write two other ones for you. It'll write one at a higher level and it'll write one at a more specific level.
Cool.
Now, they're not the right answers for you, right? We don't know exactly who the persona was, who the customer was, what the product was, but it gives you a way to say, hey, what do I think the problem statement could look like?
Mhm, mhm.
And then it also, at the end of that, it gives you a few results. So think of results as KPIs. If you're selling a B2B problem, what are some KPIs that we might be able to measure if we solve that problem? And so it's just a nice way to start to think deeper about what's the problem you're really trying to solve.
Okay. Um, just want to again go a little bit out in left field here. Um, as you know, there has been a lot of talk about AI agents and an agent economy, and a major shift in how software functionality gets packaged. How could we apply context-driven pricing, and especially well, maybe not especially. How could we apply context-driven pricing, including the notion of problem definition, to understanding what sorts of agents we should be building and taking to market?
Boy, I wish I knew the answer to that question, Stephen. I struggle still with understanding what agents really are or how to build an agent. I've used agent.ai to try to build an agent, and it was okay, but not fabulous. This thing I just described to you, I think could be called an agent. Not 100% sure. Um,
I would call pricing GPT an agent.
would you? Okay. Would
And
you?
and agents can have sub-agents. So the pricing colon piece of it then becomes sorry. The pricing colon piece of it then becomes a sort of sub-agent within the
Yep.
content.
Yep.
But I think one of the things that a lot of people are struggling with today is they have an existing software application, and my world is largely in B2B enterprise software. So they have an existing software application. It's become large, it's complex. The user interface has a lot of dimensions to it, and they're struggling to understand, okay, how would I decompose this into a problem that I can design a specific agent to solve? That's sort of central, I think, to the shift to the agent economy.
Yeah. So I don't know. I have not figured out how to get AI to answer that question for me yet. It feels to me like it's a skill that I use when I work with clients so that I could say, no, that's the problem. That's not the problem. This is a problem over here. And we start to get there. But I've had a hard time getting AI to give me the right answers.
Yeah. So
Now I've gotten
I'm not worried so much about having AI answer this question as to getting answers to the question as to what's a well-defined problem, so that one can then design an AI to help solve that problem.
I think we're in the design thinking world. This is your world, not mine. Right? So I think about what's the highest level problems. We're back to the foundational problem, the will I decision. So am I solving a problem that someone's willing to pay me money to go solve? Right.
So Mark, we're coming to the end of our time on this. What are sort of three critical things that people should be aware of and take away as they think about context-driven pricing? What are the three critical things that you would like people to be aware of and remember when they hear context-driven pricing?
Yeah, so you and I have talked about the first of three tenets in context-driven pricing. And the first tenet is willingness to pay is contextual.
Mhm.
And what we need to be doing is thinking really hard about what's the situation any given buyer is in and how can they make the best decision for themselves while we're capturing the value we're delivering to them. Right. So to me, that's number one. The second tenet to context-driven pricing is willingness to pay is malleable. And so each of the things that we talk about, hey, I've got this, a problem for this specific situation. I can educate customers. I can help customers realize that there's way more value here than they thought there was. And the more value they realize, the higher they're willing to pay. And so now I can adjust that. And the third tenet that I would give you, it's almost like a throwaway tenet, but it is so important. Perfection is impossible. Stop trying to be perfect and be better. Be better tomorrow than you are today. That's probably the most important of the three tenets, but it's also the easiest one to do.
Well, Mark, I look forward to many more conversations about context-driven pricing. And far more important, I look forward to finding ways to apply it and apply it not just in pricing, but also in decomposing existing applications to figure out what problems they solve, how they can help better define contexts, and then building agents to solve them, and of course pricing those agents. But
Yeah.
appreciate your giving me the opportunity to do this and turn the tables on you. So thank you, and now go make an impact.